Before sewing the corset, you will first of all need to print out the set of patterns enclosed with the course book. You will also find enclosed a diagram with guidelines for gluing the pattern sheets together. Materials required for sewing the corset. I will use synthetic see-through mesh for the corset. It is also known as corset mesh fabric. Beside that, I will also need a not-so-large piece of lace, about 40 centimeters long. You can feel free to choose either thin or dense lace, or simply use bits of lace left after making other garments. You will also need narrow, 0.8 centimeters, and wide, 1.2 centimeters, rigaline bones. 0.5 centimeter and 1 centimeter wide bones will also do. Additional plastic bones or metal spiral bones will make your corset more robust. You will also need a pair of cups. Their type depends on your client's preferences. I will demonstrate the principles of working with cups as such, and you will then choose cups of an appropriate configuration for your garment. You can trim the cups at the top and give them any shape you like. Bra cups are available in various styles. Cups with push-up pads, cups with space for attaching shoulder straps, thin cups without push-up pads, similar to those used in swimsuits, etc. You can always choose a matching color too. For example, you can purchase black cups if you want to sew a black corset instead of a white one. In addition, you will need some bone casing for inserting metal underwires into the cups. Bone casing is special purpose bias tape, usually sold per meter. Metal underwires. These semicircle bones need to match the shape of your cups. The underwire is supposed to be shorter than the bottom arc of the cup, by 1.5 to 2 centimeters from each end. You will need a small piece of iron-on batiste to reinforce the lacing bars. Feel free to use bits of fabric left after cutting your previous garment. Grommets for lacing the corset. I use standard grommets with a diameter of 0.5 centimeters. You can choose a matching color too. Matching washers are another compulsory element for setting grommets. Gutermann glue. I will use it for decorating the garment and for other finishing touches. Fabric for encasing the bones. I will use regular stretch satin of a matching color. It stretches lightly crosswise, and it does not stretch lengthwise at all. 30 to 40 centimeters of stretch satin with a width of 150 centimeters should be enough. Lace or other decoration materials will also come in handy. If you have failed to find see-through mesh fabric, you can replace it with 2 layers of organza or chiffon. That is, if you want to preserve the see-through effect. However, if you don't want your corset to be see-through, you can simply use any kind of opaque fabric, following the same technique. Just make sure the fabric you choose does not stretch along the waistline. Working with the sewing pattern. You are supposed to print out the set of patterns and glue them together with the help of the guidelines and a glue stick. Make sure to select actual size in your printing properties. If your printer happens to leave white borders on the pages, do not try to fix it or trim them. You can check your printing settings by measuring one of the squares on the page. It is supposed to be 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. Moreover, there is a thumbnail on every page to help you understand what part of the pattern you are looking at. After you glue together the pattern sheets and cut out the pieces, you are supposed to cut them from fabric and sew a mock-up garment. This involves joining the pieces by sewing the vertical princess seams. You don't need to sew any bones onto the mock-up. You may top stitch the seams to make them stronger. Next, you should pin the cups of your choice right onto the dress form and put the assembled mock-up on it. And then you will take all necessary measurements off the mock-up along the major circumference lines: the under bust line, the waistline, the stomach line, and the bottom of the corset. The resulting values are the dimensions of your initial pattern. Afterwards, you should compare the dimensions of the initial pattern with the corresponding measurements taken off your client and adjust the pattern accordingly. I would like to emphasize it one more time because it is really important. You should use the very same cups you are going to sew into the corset, even though you don't know its precise dimensions yet. In this case, you will get the actual size value when you measure it along the bust line. Cutting the corset. You need to prepare your fabric before cutting it. I fold the main fabric, corset mesh fabric, in half and then fold the lace in half and put it on top of it. Make sure the motifs are symmetric on both halves of the lace. I align and even out the fold lines and pin them together. If you want to place a certain lace motif in a certain area of the piece, cut it from the mesh fabric first and then arrange the lace on top of it and cut it out. There is no such need in my case, so I simply cut the main fabric and the lace overlay simultaneously. Here is how I determine the length of the lay, or fabric consumption. I arrange the paper patterns as close as possible to the way they are supposed to be arranged on fabric, and thereby determine how much fabric I will need to cut them out. There is only one basic cutting rule. There are notches at the waistline level on all pattern pieces. During the cutting, it is best to make sure these notches are placed in line, parallel to the selvage or perpendicular to the fold line if you're cutting it on the cross grain. The lace overlay of the corset can be all-way stretch, but the main fabric, corset mesh fabric, should only stretch vertically and not horizontally, i.e., along the waistline. It's a law. A corset must never stretch along the waistline. Corsets serve to restrict the body and enhance its proportions. If your corset stretches horizontally, you may as well forget about the waist restriction effect. I put the paper pieces over the fabric lay and secure them in place with pins. 1.2 centimeter seam allowances along the vertical edges are already accounted for. There are no seam allowances at the top and down the bottom. I cut the pieces out and make notches. I suggest you should not use high-quality, expensive scissors for cutting the mesh fabric. There is a great trick used by professionals, which really speeds up the cutting process. First, you cut along the top cutting lines of all pieces in one go. Then, you cut along their bottom cutting lines the same way. And only then you cut along the vertical cutting lines. Besides, you should be careful not to turn the lay around while cutting. It is supposed to lie still on the table, and you are supposed to adjust yourself to its position. One by one, I remove the pins from each cutout piece. Remove the paper, put the pieces together symmetrically, the right and the left halves, and pin them together. Insert pins so their heads stay in between the layers of fabric. It will make sewing a lot easier and prevent the needle from breaking. I place pins diagonally in the corners. Years of practice have shown these small rules to be very effective. Before sewing the princess seams of the corset, you need to join the main fabric and the lace overlay along their vertical edges, i.e., turn the two layers into a single piece. If you neglect this operation, both your main fabric and your lace will inevitably go askew during sewing. I make small stitches along the horizontal edges to prevent the lace from shifting around when I start sewing. I stitch at a presser foot distance from the edge of the main fabric. I don't make any bar tacks in the beginning or at the end of stitching. I remove the pins after making a vertical row of stitches. Remember that the main fabric is the standard, not the lace overlay. There's nothing wrong if their edges are slightly uneven. All those irregularities will stay on the seam allowances and you will later trim them. The most important thing is to make sure the lace settles evenly on top of the main fabric, without any air bubbles or creases. I have joined the main fabric and the lace overlay of all pieces, and now I can sew the vertical seams. The order in which you sew the vertical seams is arbitrary. You can move from the back to the center or from the center to the sides. However, it makes sense to start by finishing the lacing area on the central back pieces, just for the sake of convenience and to spare some time. It's easier done on a separate small piece than on a whole assembled garment. That is to say, I will now prepare the lacing bars. I take 2 straps of iron-on batiste, each 7.5 centimeters wide and 2 centimeters longer than the length of the back. I tear a 7.5 centimeter wide strap of stretch satin with the same length as the 2 straps of batiste. I press it and duplicate it with iron-on batiste from the underside. Before doing so, remember to decide whether you want to use the sheen or the matte side of the stretch satin as the face. I have chosen the sheen side as the face, although the matte side also looks quite lovely. I fold the duplicated bars in a way to make one half 4 centimeters wide and the other 3.5 centimeters wide, and secure them by pressing. The lacing bars are ready. You can serge the edge of the wider half of the lacing bar or finish it with a narrow lace trimming. I overlay it with a strap of lace, leaving it at the width I want to show from the face. I make a row of strengthening stitches a couple millimeters below the edge of the bar. I use a thick needle to help myself in challenging areas, and then I will turn it around and sew it from the other side. Let me remind you that the lace ribbon is sewn onto the wider half of the strap, 4 centimeters. I secure it from the other side. Here is how the finished lacing bars look from the face and from the underside. I need to lay a wide wriggling bone along the central raw edge of the central back piece before joining it with the lacing bar. I highly recommend you press and straighten this bone before sewing it on. It will make things a lot easier. I put the bone in place on the face of the central back piece, i.e., right on the lace. Align the edges of the bone and the piece and sew it along the inner side. I trim the excess of lace and mesh fabric. Now the edge is perfectly even. Let's sew the lacing bars in place. I turn the first lacing bar wrong side up and put the central back piece over its wider half wrong side down, so as to make the bones pass right along the pressed fold line of the lacing bar. I make a row of strengthening stitches along the outer side of the bone, close to the fold line. Please note that I don't make any bar tacks in the beginning or at the end of stitching. The fact is, there will be many rows of stitches in this area anyway, and you don't want bar tacks to make it even thicker. Let me secure the lacing bar on this piece. I make a row of joining stitches along the edge of the bar. I sew right over the face side of the see-through central back piece. At this stage, the piece looks like this. I lay an additional wide wriggling bone next to the first one and sew it on with 2 rows of parallel stitches. Then I fold the lacing bar and sew it on, moving with the presser foot along the edge of the attached bone. This way, the stitches are made 2 to 3 millimeters below the edge of the bar. To pull the lacing bar tighter, I shift its top narrow half 0.5 centimeters forward against the bottom wider half and then start stitching. The lacing bars are perfectly even. I need to make tunnels to reinforce them with plastic bones. When you lace up a corset, the greatest pressure is put on the lacing bars, and it's a big pity when it causes their deformation. They fail to hold in place, and the corset doesn't look good anymore. I basically stitch along the edge of the first bone to make a tunnel. Both tunnels are ready. I trim the lacing bars and compare their lengths. The central back pieces now have lacing bars on them. Let's continue working on the corset. As I have said before, it doesn't really matter in which order you join the corset pieces. You can either move from the center to the sides or start from one of the back pieces and basically go around in a circle. As for me, I prefer assembling it in the following order. First, I join the pieces of the back, namely the central back pieces and the side back pieces. Then I assemble the front, and then I sew the side seams. Please note how the process of sewing this corset is peculiar in that you put the pieces together underside to underside, or mesh to mesh, and join them while the lace overlay stays on top. I stitch from up to down. If you have a hard time joining the pieces without pinning them together, feel free to secure them with pins along the waistline, after aligning the notches. My advice: practice sewing vertical princess seams without pinning the pieces together. It's a very important skill, which allows you to speed up the sewing process and improve your overall competence. I assemble the back of the corset. I still don't make any bar tacks. And now, I need to top stitch the seam allowance of the joining seam from the face. The question is, where should I direct the folded seam allowance? Toward the center of the back or toward the side? The seam allowance will later get overlaid by a wriggling bone. Therefore, your decision will simultaneously determine the placement of the bone with respect to the princess seam. In other words, it will determine whether the bone will be placed on the side or the central piece of the back. The right answer depends on the style and the width of the pieces. I will turn the seam allowance toward the center of the back. Instead of stitching right over the seam allowance, I stitch from the other side, over the piece. Make sure to keep spreading out the pieces as you stitch. I trim the seam allowance down to 7 to 8 millimeters. Next, I join the central front piece with the intermediate front pieces along their vertical edges. Top stitch the seam allowances, fold them toward the center, and trim them as well. In this rather simple corset, it doesn't really matter where you direct the seam allowances before top stitching. I sew the side pieces to the front along their vertical edges. Turn the seam allowances toward the center again, top stitch them, and trim them. Please note the way I join the pieces. I even out their top edges and start stitching from up to down, and then I make a stop, even out the bottom edges, and continue stitching. This way, both the top edges and the bottom edges of the pieces are perfectly aligned. If you fail to achieve the same effect, don't look for an error in the pattern. It simply means you have joined the pieces incorrectly. They must be perfectly aligned. I trim the seam allowances. And then I join the front and back of the corset by sewing the side seams. I direct the seam allowances of the side seams toward the back of the corset. I find my way of assembling corsets very convenient because I deal with separate pieces and not the whole garment at once. Although I never made any bar tacks in the beginning or at the end of sewing, the top stitching has made the seams very robust.